Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Badger Group and Wildlife Trust webinar. We're really pleased to be joined by Jonah Tosney from Norfolk Wildlife Trust. Is that right?
Rivers Trust.
Sorry,
yeah,
the Rivers Trust.
Yeah.
There's always something I get wrong. Who's going to do a talk tonight about the chalk rivers in Norfolk, which would be amazing. We're here tonight with being hosted by the Badger Group with David Duckett, and we're putting the night on for free. So we'll post a few things in the chat if you want to make a donation, and we'll post a thing about the Badgers Group as well. So if you wanted to ask any questions, there's the Q&A section, so put your questions in there, and then David will be monitoring those as we go along. So over to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Jo. Okay, I think everybody who's with us tonight probably is a member of the Badger Group or knows me, but just in case we've got any new people, I'm chair of the Leicestershire Rutland Badger Group, and I do the usual plug for the group. We are affiliated to the Wildlife Trust, and therefore we run our own membership, and we're always looking for new members, so we'd love some people to join. If you are interested, then our website is badgergroup.org.uk, and Jo will put that hopefully into the chat line if you want to find it. Otherwise, if you can look at my phone number in Wild magazine, you can speak to me. It's in the back. Going off tonight's meeting a bit, I just want to let people know who I'm sure are all interested in wildlife. We have an announcement today that the first osprey has arrived back at Rutland Water, which I'm very much involved with. So that's the first of the season, and hopefully it's going to be the first of many to arrive. And that bird is a bird that's been interested in the Manton Bay nest site, so she is staying around as far as I know. We'll wait to see if the lady of that nest does come back. And they fight for the place, or I think that will happen. Okay, so on to tonight's meeting. I think Jo has already expressed everything. I'm obviously very, very pleased to welcome Jonah Tosney, speaking from Norfolk, from the Norfolk Rivers Trust. He is a restoration officer, and he's going to talk about restoration in chalk rivers. So over to you, Jonah.
Thank you very much, David. Right, yeah, good evening, everybody. Feels a bit odd doing this on the internet, but I'll give it a go. I can't really see what's going on your screens while I'm talking, so if you can't hear or the projector fails or something, then
Jonah, you're coming over very clearly.
Just shout out, David, if you need to. If you
can enlarge the picture, that would be great. I'm not sure if you can, but
no, that's full screen now. That's all I've got.
Okay, you're full screen. Okay.
Is that not showing as full screen on what you can see? Okay, we'll give it a go now. So yeah, I'm Jonah. I'm the technical director at Norfolk Rivers Trust. David and one of David's friends asked if I could talk to you about what we do really, which is river restoration. I think what I do and what Norfolk Rivers Trust do is quite specific. Norfolk's got some quite unique streams that are different to a lot of the rest of the country, but I think all the problems that we've got and all the ways we try to address those problems, they're equally applicable in the rest of lowland England really. So it's all about Norfolk's chalk streams, but it's equally applicable pretty much anywhere in the rest of the country, I think. Oh, this is interesting. I can't change my slide. Here we are. Yeah, okay. So we are a conservation charity, much like a wildlife trust or any of the other rivers trusts around the country. We're 13 years old and we've grown fairly dramatically. It started with two of us in a barn, and now we've got 34 staff, I think. A lot of that growth has been in the last 5 years, and I think what we're seeing is landowners and farmers really aware of climate change now. It's happening to them on their farms, and I think that's created a lot more willingness to work with conservation organisations. And at the same time, funding for conservation's kind of diversified a lot. We used to rely on government funding, basically from the Environment Agency or Europe or Natural England sometimes. But now we're getting a lot more business funding, I guess you would call it, from people like Coca-Cola and Carlsberg and Tesco and basically food producers and food sellers who use Norfolk sugar beet, Norfolk barley, Norfolk water. So that's kind of who we are. We're there to conserve and restore Norfolk's rivers and wetland habitats. So it's conservation work on anything from a ditch to a pond to a river to a lake or a wetland. Most of that is practical restoration. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we also do education work and outreach work and farm advice. So Norfolk Rivers Trust is here because Norfolk has chalk streams. Chalk streams get quite a bit of, or have had quite a bit of media attention in the last couple of years. And it's the chalk that makes them unique. So unlike Leicestershire or north of England, where I'm from, or further north or further west, in Norfolk, rainfall shouldn't run overland and straight into our rivers. It should percolate down through the soil. It should percolate into the chalk, which is permeable, and then the chalk should release the water weeks or months or years later. And during that time, it gets filtered through the chalk. It should come out of springs and fissures and seeps in the landscape, and it should come out very clean. It should come out at a fairly constant flow. So chalk streams shouldn't suffer from floods and droughts like a lot of the rest of the country does. They should be very stable environments. The water also comes out at a constant temperature, around about 8 degrees when it's coming to the surface, and it's rich in magnesium and calcium and other essential minerals. So all this stuff together makes it a really good environment for plant growth. It's got the stability that plants need. They're not going to get flushed out or suffer from drought. Yeah, and what that means is we have these really diverse river habitats. That the diversity of plant life in there is really quite special. The things that characterize chalk streams are a couple of the things you can see in the picture. So the top picture is a ranunculus species. That's a water crowfoot. It's basically an aquatic buttercup, and you get those amazing white flowers through sort of May and June. And the other one is Calitrichae starwort, which is there in the bottom picture in patches. A lot of that is actually ranunculus, but starwort gives these kind of green blooms. And that plant life, the kind of tresses of the ranunculus and the blooms of the starwort, they're absolutely brilliant invertebrate habitat. So we get this amazing plant life, and that produces an amazing diversity and richness of invertebrate life. And that feeds the whole ecosystem. That's what's feeding the trout. Some of that's feeding the crayfish and the eels, and all that stuff's feeding the kingfishers and the herons. So very wildlife rich. Also very globally rare. Depending on what you call a stream or a river, there's probably about 300 of them globally. 220 of those are in England. So that the seam of chalk runs, you can't see me away from my hands, but it runs all the way down the east coast and along the south coast as far as about Dorset. And that's where the English chalk streams are. There are also chalk streams in Normandy and Denmark, and a few places in between. But Norfolk's got a very, very high proportion of them, and they're very rich in wildlife. It's a proper wind in the willows environment. You can see again kind of what this amazing plant growth looks like in summer. The kind of background to the slide, that's the starwort, the Kalichki, and the picture on the top right is more ranunculus. We've got some amazing charismatic species that are really suffering in the rest of the country. So we've still got water voles, which have had a catastrophic national decline in my lifetime. And we've still got white-clawed crayfish. They're having an absolutely awful time, similar to grey squirrels and red squirrels. They've got a non-native American competitor, the American signal crayfish. The American is bigger and more aggressive. It outcompetes them for food. It outcompetes them for burrows and shelter. It carries a plague which the native crayfish have got no resistance to. And generally they're bullied and beaten and diseased by the Americans. And as soon as the signal crayfish turn up, that's kind of the end of that population of white-claws. Sometimes very quickly, sometimes over years. So in my time at Norfolk Rivers Trust, they've looked like they've been on a bit of a one-way path to local extinction, really. I'll talk about something we're doing about that in a little while. And the water voles, and I saw Julia's in the audience. Actually, I've met one of the audience before, so hello, Julia. The water voles have also had a catastrophic decline. There's a glimmer of hope for them recently. Their two main killers, I guess, have been habitat loss and also American mink, which are really awful water vole predators. The mink, we think, might now have been almost entirely wiped out from Norfolk and bits of East Anglia. There's been a really successful eradication program, and we think we're seeing water voles start to bounce back. Certainly on the projects we've been looking at recently, we think we're finding way more water voles than we have been in the early years of Norfolk Rivers Trust. So hopefully there's a bit of good news for water voles and a bit of good news for the crayfish that I'll come on to at the end as well. So this slide illustrates, I think, that it's not just about what goes on in the river. You can see a chalk stream there in all its glory, and you can see the blooms of plant life in the channel. But at least as important, if not more important, is the vegetated zone around the river, all this sort of marginal wetlandy vegetation on the banks. The trees are very important. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. And that's something we've learned. So when we started, what we knew about was what was in the river, and what we focused on was what was in the river, and we didn't really consider the importance of the floodplain habitat and the wetlands that come with chalk streams and all that diversity of plant life and life generally that's around the river. The river's not an ecosystem in itself, it's part of an ecosystem. And I think that slide illustrates quite well that point, really. We've got massive ecological problems in Norfolk, and these apply equally all across lowland England, really. Sorry, just let me get a drink for a sec. I've called them the big five, and I haven't really ranked them. Their importance in our work kind of changes day to day, but I think that these are the things these are our major problems. So historically, we've straightened our chalk streams. Basically, for agriculture, straight rivers are easier to farm. Straight rivers take water off the floodplain and out to sea quicker. And basically, we've spent hundreds and hundreds of years, and it is hundreds of years, trying to turn our rivers into drainage channels. And in doing that, we've lost a lot of the habitat diversity. So naturally, rivers meander, and you've got shallow bits and deep bits and fast bits and slow bits. And every single species that lives in our rivers has got slightly different habitat requirements. So with the invertebrates, some of them need fast water, some of them need slow water, some of them need gravel, and some of them need silt. And in order to have a healthy ecosystem, you need that diversity of habitat. And in straightening the rivers, we take that away and end up with something that's really uniform, really boring, and just does not provide enough diversity of habitat to support all the species that we want to see in there. Just excuse me while I plug in. Sorry, okay, I'm back. And that's associated with the next problem, which is the disconnection and the loss of our floodplains. So rivers flooding onto floodplains is a very natural and very important thing. It kind of allows the river to breathe. It allows the river to spill out and deposit its silt and deposit nutrients that are unhealthy in the river in high quantities, but the floodplain life relies on. Rivers are a good source of seeds for floodplains, for things like alder trees in particular. And floodplains are also a massive water storage. So when it's wet, they soak up water, and they release that very slowly over dry periods, and mean that drought is far less of a problem. Also, they help protect our communities against flooding. If floodplains are working, that means that water's not spilling out somewhere you don't want it to. But again, we've been draining everything and disconnecting our rivers from floodplains, and it's allowed us to produce a lot of food, and that's obviously been very important. And we can't forget that when we're talking to farmers. But the effects of that on the river have been catastrophic. Next on the list is siltation. So that this is the loss of soil from arable fields. Rain on bare soil just washes that soil straight downhill, and it finds its way into the river. It's a valuable asset in itself on the field, but in the river it's disastrous. It smothers the gravel beds where the fish spawn and what the invertebrates live, and basically chokes the wildlife. So that's a huge issue. The next one are barriers in rivers, which is what the illustration is. For a surprising number of centuries, we've been building a huge number of mills and weirs and various obstructions across our rivers. And it's harmful in two ways. So it changes the way the river works. It prevents it from transporting sediment. You basically end up with a series of lakes rather than a flowing river. But also a huge number or a huge proportion of our river species are migratory. Things like salmon are really obvious. Salmon need to get from the sea to good spawning habitat in the headwaters of rivers. If they can't do that very quickly, you've got no salmon. But equally, that applies to eels. Eels migrate backwards and forwards to the Sargasso Sea. They need clear migratory pathways. Trout can survive in relatively short sections of river. They don't need to go to sea. If they've got good spawning habitat, those populations will hold on, but they'll be massively diminished and very vulnerable because of that. But even species like dace and stickleback make migratory journeys, species that people really don't think of as migratory. And we've spent hundreds of years cutting up those migratory pathways. In more recent years, and this is particularly a problem for eels, where we've had leaky wooden structures in the past, we've been replacing those with high density plastic or metal structures where there's no leaks, there's nothing to hold on to, nothing can climb that. Eels can't squeeze through, they're not going to climb over. So barriers are a huge problem. I could have put pollution generally for the next point, and I think I probably will in the future. But phosphate has been our main concern as a pollutant at Norfolk Rivers Trust. Phosphorus is just an element that's everywhere, and it's essential for life. But it's also a fertilizer, and in high quantities, it completely unbalances ecosystems. So it's in everything. The phosphate in rivers is coming. The larger proportion comes from agriculture and fertilizers, but an almost as large proportion is coming from sewage works and septic tanks. and it's not directly toxic, so it's kind of a subtle killer really. But what it does is it's a fertilizer that some plant species are very good at exploiting. Some plant species do really well with it, and they get a bit of additional phosphate and they grow very strongly and very well. Other plant species are less good at exploiting it, and they tend to suffer and eventually get shaded out. And the species that are better exploiting it come to be dominant, and you get a simplification of the ecosystem because you're losing the more sensitive things. And it's kind of subtle because we've still got loads of native plants that look like they're growing really well, and they are doing that, but they're doing that and at the same time excluding a lot of other things that are less competitive. So if you take that to extreme levels, which we do quite often actually as humans in this country, then you start to get algal blooms replacing the plant life, and then you've got an obvious catastrophe. But yeah, up to that point, it's quite subtle, but it's also quite devastating simplification of the ecosystem, I guess. And then we've got various other problems. We've got invasive species like the mink and Himalayan balsam and American crayfish and all this other stuff. We've got people managing rivers horrendously badly still sometimes, and we're using way too much water, taking it from the environment. Farmers get hammered for this quite often because you see them visibly spraying it about, but we're eating those potatoes they're spraying it on. And also the proportion of water used by farmers is nothing compared to household usage. It's tiny. The huge majority of abstracted water goes to our homes. So we're all equally responsible for that one. So that's the doom and gloom slide there. That's that out of the way. They're the problems that are killing our rivers. And some days it's pretty horrific. But then the rest of the presentation, I think, is much more hopeful, and it's about what Norfolk Rivers Trust is, how we're trying to address those problems and make our rivers healthier places. So I've pinched and adapted this off a guy called Charles Rangeley Wilson, who we work with a lot, who's put together a national chalk stream strategy. And Charles has been talking about the three pillars of river health, which are water quantity, water quality, and habitat. I've added a fourth point in there a little bit because it suits the presentation I want to give you a bit better. But to those, I've added wildlife diversity and abundance. I'll explain why I put those on as a separate issue in a little bit. But basically, everything we're doing at Norfolk Rivers Trust is trying to address one or all of those issues. And if we can get those things right, then we can start to move our rivers back towards good health. So the rest of the talk, I'll go through that list one by one and give you examples of how we're trying to make rivers better, addressing those four pillars of chalk stream restoration, I suppose. So the first one is water quantity. It's kind of obvious. If we suck all the water out of the environment, we literally have no rivers. So it's very, very important for very obvious reasons. As I've said, the vast majority of water usage in the UK is household usage, and as a country, we're awful at cutting down water usage. Other countries have been really successful where they've had to. So Denmark lives off a very limited aquifer, and they've been very good at keeping water usage low. And I think Cape Town had a horrific drought a few years ago and managed to cut their household water usage very quickly and very effectively. So we can completely do it, but we haven't managed that yet in England. Very important. But that household usage isn't really something Norfolk Rivers Trust can do a huge amount about, other than tell people to use a bit less. But there's certainly a lot we can do to help rivers, to protect rivers from drought, basically, and hold water in the environment. So a lot of what we do is working with floodplains, trying to reconnect rivers to the floodplains, allow them to spill again. Floodplains are very effective water storage. And I said a few minutes ago that if we allow rivers to flood, that water returns to the rivers, but slowly, and helps protect them in drier periods. Also, some of the water, especially in a chalky Norfolk environment, that spills onto the floodplain, percolates downwards rather than sideways back to the river. So it's recharging the aquifer, which again is good drought prevention. Working floodplains are incredible places for nature and biodiversity, and absolutely full of life. Damaged, disconnected floodplains, much less so. The amount of wildlife diminishes pretty badly, actually, when floodplains cease to be floodplains. Floodplains are also filters, just like the chalk. So spilling water onto the floodplain actually helps improve the water quality. The river's able to dump out the phosphate and the silt it's carrying on the floodplain, where it's processed by the plant life. And this used to be a threat to farmers until quite recently. If we allow rivers to flood again, they become unpredictable, and you obviously can't grow crops on a floodplain. That's not sensible because you're very likely to lose them. But also grazing them can be a little bit of a concern, especially in places prone to flash flooding. And it's something that farmers have been worried about. That they're worried that if we're saying that rivers can spill again, then they're basically going to lose a bit of the business. But in the last few years, Natural England have been pretty good at retargeting farm stewardship, I guess, so that farmers can go into stewardship schemes and get payments to allow their floodplains to flood again. And basically farming for water and farming for rivers can become part of the business on land that is basically pretty risky to farm. So we can make that work for agriculture. And what that looks like is this. So this is the River Stiffkey. David, could you just unmute and say if you can see where I'm waving my mouse? Are you able to see the cursor moving down the screen there?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So this kind of deep green line that looks like a hedge line, that was the course of the River Stiffkey at Warham near the North Norfolk coast for about 400 years. It had been straightened and pushed to the side of the floodplain. It's obvious where the floodplain is now, but yeah, and for apparently, I think Napoleonic prisoners of war did a lot of this work. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the Norfolk rumour. For several hundred years, the River Stiffkey couldn't flood. The floodplain, occasionally farmers had attempted to crop, and more recently had given that up and returned to grazing. But it certainly wasn't profitable arable land. And basically what we've done here is try to make the floodplain work again. So just following the cursor again from the bottom right, this is the new course of the River Stiffkey. This is a project that we finished about 18 months ago, and basically we've cut nearly 2 miles of whole new meandering river channel back up at a level where it can spill onto the floodplain again, all through here and back up to the village of Whiten. And I love this one. It's been amazing. And I can say that because it's not me that's done it. It's some of my colleagues. The main objective was to allow the river to flood again, to reunite the river and the floodplain. And we've done that by working with Southampton University and finding old channels of the River Stiffkey, so historic channels from hundreds of years ago. We found where they ran across the floodplain, partly through mapping and aerial photographs, partly through auguring and looking at soil samples. We could work out where the river used to be. And we've managed to find and excavate those old channels, probably for about half of that length you can see. In some places we just couldn't find it, so we've had to join those bits up using entirely new bits. It's a very archaeologically sensitive area, so that there are other bits where the archaeologists just told us we cannot dig there. So we've had to avoid it a little bit. But basically, Southampton University have been able to tell us exactly what the channel shape should be, how deep in the floodplain that should sit in order to allow it to flood again. And we dug it in stages from 2 years ago up to about a year ago. And it's been really, really effective. It's quite amazing to see it doing what it's doing again after several hundred years. The wildlife, certainly the bird life, has responded really quickly. It's absolutely full of ducks and waders, so that's fantastic to see. It made us think quite a bit because it's so archaeologically sensitive. The bottom left of the screen, that whole area is basically an Iron Age fort. You can see the embankments there. There's a huge amount of archaeology, and we had to have an archaeologist with us for every dig of the digger bucket. They didn't find particularly much, but they did find a very old ford, which crossed the channel at a height and a place where we thought we'd identified where the channel should be, and that kind of confirmed that we got it basically right. But also that they found a couple of old fish traps that are basically stakes and wicker baskets attached. And these are quite common finds all over the UK and probably all over the whole world, actually. But what that showed, I think, to me, was that this little river in North Norfolk used to have populations of migratory fish that were worth catching. And for a long time now, it just hasn't had that. There are trout in there, but not really many. There are eels in there, but eels are now critically endangered. But at the time those traps were built, it would have had runs of salmon, it would have had runs of sea trout, it would have had big runs of eels in probably the autumn. They'll probably catching the silver eels on the way out. They'll probably catching both, actually. The silver eels on the way out, and then the elvers on the way up in the spring. But other species like smelt and shad would have all used these rivers, I think, lampreys. And it really made us think. So we've been happy at Norfolk Rivers Trust if we deliver a project and we get maybe a 10 or 20% increase in trout numbers. Until recently, we've thought that's a really good result. And it's taken this and kind of the restoration of beavers and eagles nationally, and just sort of a growing awareness of how much we have lost and how much it might be possible to restore. So it's been brilliant to see it, but it's also really opened our eyes to what we should be aiming for, I think. So quite exciting. So that's pillar one, putting rivers back onto floodplains. The next step is clean water. Some of our problems are outside of our control. Sewage works and septic tanks and farm runoff. But we work with all those people. We've got a farm advice team working with farmers, trying to help them reduce soil runoff and fertilizer loss. And that's something farmers are getting very good at. In some ways, agriculture has evolved a lot more quickly than conservation in the last few years, although I think we've had an amazing rush of new conservation knowledge recently. We also do education things about septic tanks, and we do work with Anglian Water a lot, and they are doing a lot of work to improve what they do, but still further room for improvement. Something we've done at 4 sewage works over the last few years is we've built wetlands to cleanse the effluent from the sewage works. So these are all sewage works that have been doing their jobs mostly perfectly legally and discharging perfectly legal amounts of phosphate to these tiny little sensitive chalk streams. And because they're doing their job absolutely fine as far as the legislation is concerned, there's zero chance of investment in them. Anglian Water aren't going to upgrade them, because why do you invest in something that's doing its job fine? If you're a water company, that just doesn't really happen. But even though the sewage works are doing what they're supposed to be doing, they're still putting a huge amount of phosphate into tiny little streams. And we had one case where you could really visibly see the results of that. Most of our rivers actually are failing Water Framework Directive status for phosphate. So it's something that we wanted to do something about, and we did the first one of these 12 years ago when we were new and small and nobody was going to help us and nobody wanted to draw attention to the problem. But we looked at it, and initially we thought a reed bed might be a good thing to do to clean up water. And reed beds are good at that for certain things. But we had a recent graduate with us who looked at the science a bit more carefully and said probably the best thing you can do is build a more diverse wetland. These are used for water cleaning pretty much the world over. That they're an established technology, and there's loads of science out there showing that they do work and how they work and why they work. So we thought we'd have a go at that, and over the past 12 years we've built 4 of these wetlands, and this is what they look like. So now, instead of the effluent from the sewage works going into these little chalk streams, we're now feeding it into these wetlands that we plant with native species grown on from Norfolk seed. So it's all you can see flag iris there, and marsh marigold, and basically Norfolk rushes and reeds, and all kinds of there's loads of stuff in the picture actually. All kinds of Norfolk native wetland plant life, and they're amazing filters. So the first site we did this, we've reduced phosphate input to the tiny little stream by something like 80% consistently over 12 years now. And we're taking out about 100 kilos of phosphorus a year that would otherwise end up in that stream. And if you imagine that as bags of fertilizer, that's huge, and the damage that must do to the river is huge. So we're really pleased about that. So they're not only cleaning up water, and it works for phosphate, they're quite good for nitrate. They sequester carbon, although they do release methane and nitrous oxide. So we have to understand the balance there. They are very good at preventing bacterial pollution. They're very good at preventing pharmaceutical pollution. It's shocking what's coming through sewage works out of people's houses. But wetlands are pretty good at cleaning most of it, and that's really important. But equally important, they create very good habitat. And Norfolk's lost somewhere way in excess of 90% of its wetlands, and chalk streams absolutely need them as a source of clean water, and kind of as an extension of that aquatic environment as well. So they're not particularly biodiverse because the water coming into them isn't clean. So we don't get particularly sensitive species in there. But what we do get is a huge amount of life, fly life and dragonflies. Absolutely loving it in there. And that fly life feeds birds, and in particular warblers and swallows and all the migrants that are coming here from Africa just to eat our fly life. The wetlands are a really good source of that. Also really good for waterfalls actually. They've colonized quite nicely, and we've got things like marsh harriers that are now eating the waterfalls and eating the ducklings. But yeah, they've been brilliant. Step 3 is habitat quality. So I tried to explain earlier how nature and rivers need complex, messy habitat. That the complexity is really important. If you look at this picture and imagine that you are a freshwater shrimp or a caddisfly in that river, that's the structure provided by that plant life. That gives you a lot of different places to live, a lot of food sources in there. And it's so important. And the messier it is and the more complex it is, the more diversity of habitat you've got. And the more diverse the habitat is, the more diverse the species that can use it will be. So having messy, complex, complicated habitat is really, really important. And there's loads of ways we can improve habitat quality. Trees in rivers are the most simple, easy, and effective way of improving habitat quality. A tree falling in a river improves the habitat instantly. So it breaks up the flow, and if you've got a straightened, uniform river and a tree falls into it, suddenly you've got fast water and slow water. Water backs up behind it and then squeezes under it and round it. It starts to create pools and riffles again, and as the water's squeezing through, it'll start to clean up gravels, pushing the silt out, create places for fish to spawn. It's also good habitat. A lot of the invertebrates are shredders, and I've forgotten the other word, but a lot of things will live off and live in that dead and decaying wood. So it's a good food source. Trees also provide shade, which is very important for keeping rivers cool. Can provide too much shade. Rivers also need light, otherwise we'll lose all that plant growth. So getting that balance right is important. But dropping a tree in a river just instantly creates amazing habitat. You can see in this picture what it's doing, so that the river is flowing from the right-hand side to the left-hand side. Trees falling in. This isn't a Norfolk Rivers Trust thing. This is a nature thing here that I've just photographed and tried to copy for years. You can see, so instantly there's a little waterfall over there. That's aerating the water quite nicely. The water's flowing faster as it's squeezing under and around these branches. To the left of the screen, that's cleaning the gravels over here below the Norfolk Rivers Trust logo. And that's creating trout spawning habitat. So that is awesome. The amount of food in there has just gone through the roof. The amount of places to shelter for a caddisfly or a young trout has suddenly increased massively. Young fish are fairly safe from predation in there, from bigger fish like pike or from otters and herons and things. So trees falling in rivers, just absolutely brilliant. We fairly regularly get landowners apologising to us when we turn up and a tree has fallen in and they haven't taken it out. They feel bad about that and they feel they should keep the rivers tidy. That's absolutely wrong. The messier your river is with fallen trees, the healthier it's going to be. So hugely important. And a lot of our projects are as simple as pushing a few trees into rivers. The impact's quite dramatic, and just in doing that, you increase the invertebrate numbers and the fish numbers within a year. Just absolutely guaranteed, time after time. So trees in rivers, brilliant. Also, we can put meanders back. We can unstraighten straight rivers. This is Bayfield Hall on the River Glaven. You can see the lake. So the River Glaven used to flow where the lake now is. About 120 years ago, the owners decided they would like an ornamental lake, so they dammed the river. That created Bayfield Lake. The river was carrying a lot of sediment even back then into the lake, and it was silting up and causing them maintenance headaches. So they diverted the river 120 years ago through a kilometre of brickwork tunnel, and you can just, I've lost the map, you can just about see that line to the left of the river still in places where the reef has collapsed. But basically for 120 years the river, I was going to say flew, it didn't flew, it flowed through a brickwork tunnel. It wasn't dead. Trout were somehow able to migrate through that, and eels, and they did do that. But the life in there was obviously massively diminished, and something was lost from the environment. Again, about 12 years ago, we got our first big grant to deliver this project. Worked with a UEA professor called Richard Hay, who's an incredible hydrologist. He spent his whole career studying how rivers flow and trying to understand the maths of that, and then applying that maths to projects like this. So he's designed these meanders, and they're mathematically perfect, and it can tell you the flow speed around each bend and the depth of each pool. And we did this. Yeah, I think we did it in 2014 or maybe 2015. We finished it, and so the maths and the hydrology were right, and we based it on the hydrology of bits of the River Glaven that we thought were undamaged further upstream. Excuse me a minute. And it came to life really, really quickly. So trout found that new bit of river straight away. So we finished digging, I think, in about March time. Trout spawn in the autumn, and by November time, there were trout spawning in here. Bullhead spawned in their first opportunity, and they started to colonize with eels. And things like lamprey arrived quite quickly, that brook lamprey, these are, that we thought were fairly sedentary, but they were colonizing this new bit of river really quite quickly. It took a while to be complete. So as you see it there, this was in the very early days of, I think this was pre-drones actually. This might have been out of a helicopter or something. But this is it just completed basically. And until the plants colonize the river, basically it doesn't work. You need the plants to get the hydrology right, because they start to squeeze the flow and increase the speed of the water, but at the same time hold water back and provide all that habitat for invertebrates that I've spoken about. So it probably took 2 or 3 years for the plant life to really take off and bed in. But since that point, despite it being completely unnatural in a lot of ways, as far as we can tell, ecologically, it's as good as any other bit of the River Glaven. So we can do this stuff. We can unstraighten straight rivers and kind of allow nature to breathe again, I guess. Okay, so this is probably the best bit as far as I'm concerned. So that was step 3, why habitat quality is important and what we can do about it. Step 4, I would not have talked about a few years ago. So this is about wildlife and why we sometimes need to bring it back. So we used to work on the basis that if we create good habitat with clean water, then the wildlife will take care of itself. And we stuck with that for quite a few years, but recently it's become clear that just isn't true. And there are a lot of species that should be here, which will never be here again unless we do something about it. Beavers are a very good example of that. And it's not just that, actually. It's also that until these species are back here, these rivers just are not healthy rivers. I don't think you can say you've got a healthy Norfolk chalk stream that doesn't have beavers in it. I think that the role of beavers in creating wetlands and creating habitat for other aquatic life is absolutely critical, and there is no replacement for that. We, Norfolk Rivers Trust, can absolutely not compete with the quality of and the speed of work that beavers do, actually. And the same with species like salmon, which aren't currently in Norfolk. Salmon create habitat for a lot of the other river creatures. Salmon dig massive nests in river gravels every year when they swim upstream to spawn. And in doing that, they dislodge a lot of the silt from the gravel. So they're cleaning the gravel as they do it. And in cleaning that gravel, they're creating spawning opportunities for smaller creatures like brown trout and brook lamprey and bullhead. And also that they're allowing that flow of water through the gravels again. And those spaces between the gravels, that's where a lot of the things like the mayfly and stonefly live. So a lot of these creatures that aren't here, we cannot have healthy rivers until they come back. And some of those creatures can't come back on their own. They need our help. I've used beavers as an example. Norfolk Rivers Trust has put a pair of beavers in an enclosure 4 years ago. It took us literally 8 years to be allowed to release 2 native rodents into a fenced enclosure, which still seems absolutely ridiculous. But we got there. We'd like to release them freely at some point soon, and it looks like the legislation might allow us to do that. But for the time being, we've got beavers in an enclosure at the top end of the River Glaven. The work they're doing is absolutely incredible. This was basically a dried out woodland. It was used as a pheasant rearing pen. It had a tiny little stream through it, no more than a foot wide, right in the headwaters of the river. The beavers are in a 7-hectare enclosure, just one pair initially, and in the first 4 years in there, they've created at least 4 hectares of really high quality wetland. And see the wildlife bounce back in there is amazing. Things like water shrews running through the beaver dams, and teal using it in winter, kingfishers, all kinds of things. Otters quite happily climbing the beaver fence and having a scoot around in there. All kinds of wildlife, and it's just going to get better and better. So the thing that delighted me most, I think, was when we put the beavers in. We did amphibian surveys beforehand. There were a few clumps of frog spawn. It's the same story as Devon and Scotland and everywhere beavers have ever been, really. We had a few clumps of frog spawn, very few amphibians and reptiles, partly because it was a massive pheasant pen. That certainly didn't help. But within a year, the habitat available for them increased massively, and the frogs responded really quickly. And you can see that this is the first time for, I don't know, centuries that frogs are spawning, and that the young froglets are emerging into habitat that they can now colonize, that their world is getting better, and that's a direct result of the beavers. So that's been absolutely fantastic to see. I hope I've got a little bit of footage of them dam building. They're absolutely relentless workers. If you've never seen beavers at work, it's quite special. They're almost obsessive compulsive when they start doing one activity. So this one was piling mud on the side of the dam, and it'll do that for hours and hours and hours, absolutely relentlessly, and then it'll stop and go for a rest or do something else. But they're incredible workers. So let me see if I can play it. So that's them in action, dam building. And then just having them back in the native environment is also a really special thing. You can see the size of tree there that they're happy to take on. That's an absolutely enormous poplar tree. The beavers themselves are the size of probably Labradors with no legs, basically. They're about 30 kilos each, those two animals. Again, just let me see if I can play it. So they're doing incredible things, creating all this other habitat for wildlife, for water shrews and water voles and dragonflies and ducks, and just it's amazing. Now we're stuck on the slide. So Norfolk Rivers Trust relies massively on academic partnerships. We use the monitoring budget that we're able to get is quite limited. So we use students and student supervisors to look at what we're doing, basically, and tell us what's working, what's not working, and how we can make it better. They do that across all kinds of Norfolk Rivers Trust projects, but the beavers obviously are a massively attractive thing for students to look at. So they've been really popular. So we've got people looking at water storage, and they're storing loads of water, obviously, Water quality, UEA have just published a paper showing that the Norfolk beavers are cleaning the water as it goes through the enclosure. We expected that, but to measure it and see it happen is really cool. We're looking at greenhouse gas balance, same as any of our wetlands. They're locking up carbon really quickly, sequestering carbon, but also they are releasing methane and nitrous oxide. We need to work out what the balance is there. And then the biodiversity, the bird life in there is changing. It's difficult to compare. I guess we will lose some species that like dry woodland, maybe, but the amount of species that we're creating habitat for is quite incredible. As the trees, so they fell a lot of trees, but also they're drowning some trees. So we've got standing dead wood in there, and that's brilliant for woodpeckers. We'd love it to be great for willow tits, although they're long gone. I don't know what their prospects are of coming back. But we're creating great bird habitat. Amphibians, very good. Reptiles, we've got no reptiles, and I don't know if this is something we should do something about. I don't know if it's just because it was a pheasant pen. It's amazing grass snake habitat. I'm not sure grass snakes can get there through the surrounding arable land. I don't know what their pathway would be. So maybe there's something we need to do something about. Aquatic invertebrates, as you would expect, have absolutely gone through the roof in terms of numbers and in terms of diversity. Terrestrial invertebrates the same, actually, and I think that'll continue as the amount of dead wood on the floor and standing in trees increases. I read that a huge number of British beetle species rely on dead wood at some point in their life cycle. So to be putting that back into the environment, I think has got to be a good thing. And the plant community is changing as well massively. Again, it's a bit hard to make a judgment on that. We're killing hornbeam trees that they've drowned out a row of hornbeams. I personally don't mind that because I know it's going to create amazing habitat, but that is a loss. But then we're gaining a lot of other things. We're starting to see the aquatic plants really come into their own this year or two. So it's a rebalancing, and I think it's very strongly positive. The little illustration there, by the way, I nearly forgot that. That's just an example of the sort of things people do to measure nature now. So we don't always have ecologists out there counting things. That's a sound recorder, that thing, and we're using sound recorders now with the University of East Anglia to identify not just bats, as we've been able to do for a little while, but all kinds of things that will identify birds and various invertebrate species. And we're doing eDNA samples. So we've got people telling us what's there without them ever seeing it, really, which I don't know how I feel about it. The knowledge from it is brilliant, but what it does for young ecologists, I'm less sure. Oh yes, the last thing I said I'd come back to crayfish and a little story of hope. So as I said, they're on a one-way trip to local extinction because of the invasive American signal crayfish. And we're not going to turn that around because at the moment there is no answer to the signals. But what we are doing is we're giving them a chance. So Banham Zoo, we're now taking egg-bearing female crayfish, a small number from a population that we know is going to disappear. We're taking to Banham Zoo each year. They're breeding them on for us, and the survival in the zoo, the survival rates are really good. Sorry, let me have a drink. And then we're releasing those into sites in the wild, like the River Stiffkey, where we hope they'll thrive. Initially, they weren't really doing that. We've put them in probably 6 bits of river, and they've held on. A couple of them they've disappeared from. I think about 4 of them they've held on in. We did the initial release in the Stiffkey nearly 15 years ago, And for about 10 years, they were there, they were still there, the native crayfish, but the numbers were tiny, and the effort we had to put in to find one was immense, and we weren't sure it was working. But then in the last 3 years, they've really started to take off, and it's been brilliant to see that they're not great colonizers. It seems to take them a while to get going, but they have finally got going in at least one of the release sites. So we're able to start these new populations elsewhere in habitat that is safe for now. And we also know that if worse comes to worse, we do have a population safe in Banham Zoo. So even for the crayfish that are having a disastrous time, we think we can do something a little bit hopeful to give them a chance. I've got one more picture. These are spawning brook lamprey, and I use these as an illustration of what we're trying to do, because brook lamprey need everything a healthy river provides. They need fast, shallow water and deep, still water. They need gravel to lay their eggs in, and silt for the young ones to live in. And they migrate between these different areas of habitat within quite small patches of river. So they're a really good illustration of when a river's working well, brook lamprey can thrive. So they are hopefully one of the ultimate beneficiaries of Norfolk Rivers Trust's work. And that's the end of the presentation. So I'll stop sharing, and David, I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Jonah. An excellent overview. And as you said, I think at the start, the same sort of work is going on around the rest of the country. I think we have some work.
Yes, it is.
Similar in Leicestershire and Rutland going on. And it's just excellent to see changes that can be brought about in wildlife if the right things are done. I haven't picked up any questions yet if people want to fire some in, but I've got a few as usual. Yeah, I'll start. So the first one is with beavers. You've just did a pair, I assume, were introduced, a male and female. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we put a pair in.
Have they bred?
Yes, they have. So we put them in 2020 or 21. I can't remember. They've been in there about 4 years. The first year we thought they hadn't bred, but I since think I've seen another beaver in there that must be one of the first year offspring. So I think they possibly had one kit in the first year, definitely had 2 kits in the second year, and definitely had 3 kits in the third year. So we think over the 4 years we've either got 7 or 8 beavers in there. We've got room for double that, but if they breed well this year, we're going to have to start looking at moving the older ones on. It will start to get a bit tight over the next couple of years. So that is something we need to.
The Labour Party have just introduced this new legislation allowing freedom of beavers. Is that something you can tap into?
Yes, we're going to put in an expression of interest. It's not as easy as it might sound. That there's a lot of conditions. We've done a huge amount of preparatory work to be able to do this. So we've had to model flood risk. We've had to look at where beaver dams might create problems. We've spoken to, I think, every farmer in the catchment. So we've done a lot of groundwork to do that. But it's not guaranteed that we will be allowed. But we'll see how we get on. That is the ambition. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you mentioned farmers. Phil has put in a question: what has been the response from farmers, landowners to the reintroduction of beavers?
My God, and entirely mixed. So we've got one that comes into the office fairly regularly. He is our landlord, to be fair, so he can come in when he likes. But our landlord is a farmer on the River Glaven where the beavers are, and he comes in and asks me very loudly why I haven't got him any effing beavers yet and when are they coming. So we've got some farmers that absolutely welcome them. We certainly had a couple of unhappy farmers initially. Some of that is so they can create problems. There's no doubt about that. They'll nibble crops. They can burrow under trackways. They can flood out corners of fields. So you would be a little bit concerned if you're a farmer. A lot of it is misconception. So that the guy that was most angry sincerely believed that beavers ate pheasants. And that was one of the concerns. So we kind of got over that one, but it's really mixed, you know. It's I guess it's just a cross section of humans, really.
But hopefully a changing attitude is going to prevail.
Yeah, I would say sort of broadly positive. A lot of them just don't care because they've been to see them and they can see it's no threat to the higher arable ground, and some of them still don't like it because I think it's a loss of control over the land, and I think sometimes people don't like that.
Okay, I've got another question. You said you've eradicated the mink.
Yeah, we haven't, but there's been an East Anglia wide mink eradication program.
So before you answer that anymore, in terms of waterfoals, have they not naturally come in more, or is there a potential reintroduction that might occur?
I think that they're bouncing back quite well. So I think that there are two things going on. If we make good waterfowl habitat near a population of voles, that they will colonize it and use it. But I think so the mink trapping program has been going on since I think before COVID, so I think 5 or 6 years, and it's been done professionally and very well, and it seems like it's been very effective. So not Norfolk Rivers Trust, but a predator that waterfowls cannot deal with, and a predator that absolutely loves waterfowls and will wipe out colonies very quickly has been removed. And there were relatively high numbers of mink, so this massive threat to them has gone. And this isn't based on evidence. This is based on what we're seeing at work. We think there are a lot more waterfowls about than there were a small number of years ago.
But you're not doing any monitoring as such.
No,
because we are in Leicestershire.
Not that would show that. No.
Okay. You said about trees in rivers and how very good they are. Do you actually create ever leaky dams, what I call leaky dams, where you throw a lot of brash, etc., in trees?
Yes, we do that. We've got to be anything like that we do has to be licensed by the Environment Agency, and we have to demonstrate that we're not causing flood risk. So we have to be a little bit careful with it. But yeah, we absolutely do that. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just checking anything in. No, you've had some comments. Thanks, Jonah. That was really interesting. Hope you're well. That's from Julia, who I think you know.
Yes, thank you, Julia.
Right.
If you've got waterfowl questions, don't ask me, ask Julia.
Okay, I've got one more question, unless anyone else has sent anything. Not yet, no. You've got about 10% of English chalk streams in Norfolk, wasn't it? You had about
something
10%.
Like that,
yeah, like approximately. In the streams of the whole of Norfolk, they're not all chalk streams. What sort of percentage of your streams are chalk streams, or don't you know?
About 2/3 of Norfolk has got chalk under it, so probably about 2/3 of Norfolk rivers are chalk streams, roughly.
Okay.
Give or take 30%. I don't know, something like that.
Well, and they are wonderful, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
They seem to obviously hold more wildlife than your average stream, as you explained. I think I've come to the end of the questions I was going to ask. I think you got some thanks on the chat line, but no other questions. So I'll round off myself by thanking you very much for a wonderful talk. And
Thank you, David.
I'm sure people are going to apply that sort of thing to the rest of the country. Is Joe still with us? Do you want to round off in a few comments? Beggings,
Yeah,
like donations?
Thank you, Jonah. That was a fantastic talk. It's great to hear about the beavers. I've had a chat about beavers with Matt, our CEO, and our head of nature recovery. And who knows, maybe one day we'll see them in Leicestershire Rutland. I know there's certainly positive about it, obviously, ever since the recent news that we've had with the government, being a bit more, what's the word, releasing the licenses and not being so hesitant, with that.
Yeah.
So that's really great news. I think it's just about finding the right places to release them, and but anyway, I don't want to get involved in that, to be honest. But they said they would love to see beavers in our counties one day. And then talking about the rivers, I've learned quite a lot from what you said. That's really fantastic. So thank you for all that insight and your amazing knowledge. So
I thank you.
yeah,
Before we
I really enjoy it.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Before we finally close, there's another question or a combined question come to you. So I think it's from Jackie Woodcock. How fast flowing is the River Glaven at Bayfield, and how long will it take to establish and eventually form Oxbow Lakes? And another bit, how many sewage wetlands have you created and where are these? So she's probably asked 3 questions in one.
Good questions. I've got to go and get my daughter in about 2 minutes, but I'll answer Jackie, and then I'll have to be on my way.
Yeah,
So how fast is the River Glaven? I used to know an actual answer for that. So it flows reasonably quickly, but it's not powerful. Norfolk's got no gradient at all, and the rivers have got very little power. So that's one of the reasons that we need to do a lot of the stuff we're doing in places like the Lake District with a lot of gradient. Anytime a river floods, it'll completely reorganize itself into something much more natural. Norfolk doesn't have that gradient, and the rivers haven't got that power, and they're basically not able to fix themselves. So it's not going to form Oxbow Lakes. It's got close to zero erosive power. So that's one of the reasons we need to help out. We have built 4 wetlands at Sewage Works, sort of across the Norfolk coast actually. So North Reps, Diffkey, Langham, and Inglesthorpe, all basically a little village sewage works. So yeah, that's where they are. I'd better leave you there because
so thank you very much, Jonah. A great talk. So we'll say goodbye to you, and I'll give you some applause. And thank you to Joe and the Wildlife Trust for hosting the meeting, and to all you with us that have attended. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I have. Okay.
Thank you.
Night,
Thanks
everyone.
a lot. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
bye. Bye.